This is Shaquille O'Neal with a friendly holiday reminder. 'Tis never the season to scream at your printer, call it naughty names, or chunk empty ink cartridges across the room. But 'tis always the season for an Epson EcoTank printer. They're cartridge-free, conniption-free, with big ink tanks and a ridiculous amount of ink. So grab some mistletoe, mwah, and kiss expensive cartridges goodbye. The Epson EcoTank, just feel and chill. Available at Office Depot and Staples.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about the worst peacetime disaster up until 1844, and that is the explosion of the USS Maine. And this is an explosion that killed a number of top U.S. cabinet officials and came close to killing the President of the United States.
And Ray, once again, it's just another reminder of there's so many interesting stories in American history. And they get lost in the midst of all of these major milestone events. We know about the Declaration. We know about the Civil War, Revolutionary War, all of these other things. But Ray, this was, a disaster in which it killed more top government officials in a single day than any other tragedy in American history. And we read these novels that discuss what happens when all of American government officials would be in the same room or in the same location, and how they have a designated survivor. And it's because of things like this to ensure that if there is a disaster, which this is an accident, right? I mean, it's just an accident, but how this accident could have changed the course of history. And Ray, I just want to thank you, because I wasn't aware of this. And so we can be historians, we can teach history classes, and we still don't know every single event that occurs. And that's why I love this podcast, because not only does this allow us the opportunity to talk about unique stories and some really cool things, but it helps me learn some things that I've never learned before. And Ray, I'm already telling you, I'm going to put this into my courses that I teach, because it is so fascinating to tell.
Yeah, it is. It is. And one of the things you were talking about, the idea of the designated survivor, we're going to talk about him in a second. But John Tyler is the president. The accident occurs. Let's just go ahead and get into it. The accident occurs February 28, 1844, aboard a new U.S. Navy steam frigate called the USS Princeton. President John Tyler is aboard the ship, along with, we're going to talk about this, other government officials. But at the time, if we remember, John Tyler became president in 1844 after the president who was actually elected, William Henry Harrison, died about 30 days after being inaugurated, thus making the vice president, John Tyler, president of the United States in 1841. So John Tyler, he is president of the United States, but he doesn't have a vice president. And when we think about how close he was to this explosion, and we'll talk about it in a second, there wasn't a number two. Now, there's always that sort of order of, what happens if the president dies? What happens if this person dies? What happens if this person dies? But there is no vice president. And as we're getting to see, some top cabinet officials were killed in this explosion. If President Tyler had been just a few feet more in one direction, the United States would have faced a constitutional crisis here for the second time in 5 years, because of course, William Henry Harrison, when he died in 41, was the first president of the United States to die in office.
Yeah. And once again, while we consider this accident, there were several things that were done that really led to this problem. And, as you mentioned, this all comes about on board of the USS Princeton, which had been launched on September the 5th, 1843. And this was at the time a state-of-the-art ship. I think it had the very first screw propellers, and it had these really big guns. And, for our listeners, they kind of got to think through where we are in history. We're in 1844. So this is pre-Civil War. So we're not using I mean, our concept of naval warfare is still in its infancy. We use some of these things during the Revolutionary War, but using cannons and guns and what would be known as long guns, these are unheard of. So we're still getting familiar with it. And it just so happened that this ship had the largest naval gun in the world. And America likes to be first. They like to have their big guns, their big things. And so, Ray, the largest gun in the world was named, so ironically, the Peacemaker, I think. And this gun, they wanted to show it off. But you got to be careful to show off, certain things in certain ways. And we didn't do that. So we've got the boat, USS Princeton, state of the art. And now we have this gun, which is the Peacemaker. And Ray, we also have a bunch of people that kind of get cocky and want to show off just how big and powerful the Navy is.
Yes, this gun is 12-inch, 27,000 pound cannon on this boat. And it's very interesting when I look at it, because sometimes in history, you see this, for example, with the Challenger disaster and with other disasters, is there were warnings. There were people before the disaster who said, maybe this isn't a good idea. And the guy who actually designed this gun, or one of the guys who designed this gun, a guy named John Erickson, had actually said, look, we've built this gun. It's great and wonderful, but I'm not really sure this thing is ready for prime time. We haven't really tested it the way we should have tested it. I'm not sure that this is a really good idea. But the ship's captain, a guy named Robert Stockton, was just absolutely determined that they were going to fire this gun. And not only were they going to fire it once, they were going to fire it twice. Ultimately, they're going to try to fire it 3 times. And the co-designer, John Erickson, maybe you need to rethink this, but like you said, arrogance and the desire to, you've got all these big dignitaries. For crying out loud, you've got the President of the United States, John Tyler. You've got former First Lady Dolly Madison. You've got the Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy aboard this ship. Excuse me, not Secretary of War, Secretary of Navy and Secretary of State. I mean, you've got some important people. You've got the son of former Vice President John Calhoun. You've got a large group of people. It's about 200 people. But among those people are these very important dignitaries. And it's like, we're going to put this ship out. We're going to fire this cannon. And we don't care what you've got to say, because this is our moment to show off. And of course, it backfired on them. No pun intended there. It's absolutely going to backfire on them.
And that was really good. I'm impressed that you threw out that pun.
I know. Usually that's your job.
I know, shots fired. So that was really good. So what's interesting is it wasn't just the Peacemaker was not the only gun. There was another gun that was on board that was called the Orator, that later is called the Oregon. And the Oregon, or the Orator, had undergone intensive testing. That was one that they had looked at and they had tested, and they saw that when it was fired that there were some cracks that were kind of detrimental to the integrity of the cannon. And so, Stockton, wanting to please the crowd, decides, all right, get that other gun. We've got, and Ray, there's anywhere from 200 to 400 people on this ship, and they've got their cupcakes and their drinks, and they're just waiting for a big show. And Captain doesn't want to look like a fool. And so basically he just gets this Peacemaker and he says, get it out here. We're going to fire it. And they're like, sir, we haven't tested it. We're not sure it's ready. And he's like, I don't care. Get it out here. And Ray, you're exactly right, because, the guy who helped invent it or create it said it had only been tested 5 times. 5 times. And you're willing to take something like that and put it on show with the President of the United States and everything else, and saying that it's ready to go. And so, Ray, you have this captain in wanting to improve his ranking, wanting to make himself look good, tells everybody, come on deck. We've got something for you. We've got this big show. Let's look at a demonstration of the guns. and everybody makes their way to the deck. And isn't it interesting? Here's that fate thing, that President Tyler doesn't make it to the deck because somebody stops and wants to ask him a question and wants to have a drink with him.
Yeah.
You know, Ray, it's always that, well, if I would have done that 5 seconds sooner or 5 seconds later. So I just think it's interesting that, as fate would have it, Tyler doesn't make it to the top because of drinks and because of somebody who stops him.
Yeah, and he does give some toasts down there. They're below, I guess, on the lower floor of the ship, and he is asked to give a toast, and he does. And it's at that moment, it's in the midst of this toast, that the cannon, the Peacemaker, is fired for the third time. It had already been fired twice by this point. And even the captain, who we talked about, Robert Stockton, who was the one sort of pushing, we need to get this thing fired. You know, you talked about that too. Even at this point, he's like, we've gotten away with this twice. Maybe we don't need to push this a third time. He was actually opposed to firing the cannon the third time. And exactly who was the one who sort of said, we are firing the cannon again? Some say it was Secretary of Navy. Some say it was the Secretary of War. Whichever one it was, one of these men with clout, with these so-called important men, they made the order to fire. And of course, this is a U.S. Navy ship. So if one of those guys say, we're going to fire this cannon, guess what you're going to do? You're going to fire the cannon. This is not a private ship where the captain can sort of overrule. This is a military vessel, a U.S. Navy vessel. So the Secretary of War or Secretary of Navy, they say we're firing the cannon, then they're going to fire the cannon. That's exactly what happened. And as President of the United States, John Tyler was still below ship, and a number of other people, like you said, had come up to the top deck. The Peacemaker was fired, and instead of putting off a nice shot like it had 2 times before, it explodes, and the deck of the USS Princeton becomes a war zone during peacetime.
Yeah, I mean, I think killed 6 people, and these were not just, these were 6 high-level officials, including, as you mentioned, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Navy. You've got the captain, all of these people. Even found it interesting that a slave who was on board of that ship also lost their life through this. And it just goes to show, when people are focused more on glorifying themselves, that's where danger really comes in. And for some of these individuals, the course of history changes. I know that you've spent some time recently studying the life of, and we've talked about him on a podcast, of John C. Calhoun. And you've spent some time recently kind of digging into him, digging into his life. And, basically John C. Calhoun of South Carolina actually rises to the position of Secretary of State because of this.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you know the story better than I do, but does Calhoun get that spot if the Peacemaker doesn't explode?
Well, no, the people who are in place, John Calhoun's relationship with John Tyler wasn't exactly a close one necessarily. So no, I don't think he does. Tyler, we have to remember, was a Whig. He was the second Whig president in American history. The first Whig was William Henry Harrison. He dies, Tyler becomes president. Of course, one thing that Tyler and Calhoun had in common was their dislike of Andrew Jackson. So they did have something in common there. But one interesting thing about it, I may have alluded to it earlier, I may not have, is one of John Calhoun's sons, Patrick Calhoun, is a second lieutenant. He's aboard this ship, and he writes his father and talks about, the explosion and how bad it was and everything. And so Patrick Calhoun is right there and sees it happen. But you mentioned fate and how sometimes fate steps in. So you have on the second floor down below deck, you have President John Tyler, who is 54 years old. Okay. John Tyler at this point in his life is a widower, right? When it's a guy, it's a widower, right?
Yeah.
He's a widower. His first wife, a lady named Latita Taylor, she died about 2 years before this in the White House, becoming the first lady to die while her husband was in office. Well, one of the people so Tyler's a widower. He's aboard the ship. Again, he's 54 years old. That is important. One of the people who was aboard the ship was a guy called David Gardner. Okay. That is Julia Gardner's father. Now you say, what's the significance of this? John Tyler had a thing for Julia Gardner. Okay. Now the thing is, she's like 23 years old. So he's technically, I guess, old enough to be her father, but he's still got something for her. And when she finds out that her father is one of the ones killed, she faints. Tyler takes her back to the White House to try to sort of console her in her moment of grief. And she, and of course, he starts pushing the idea of marriage. And she initially, not interested in you, old man, get away from me. But eventually she caves in and they are married. This occurred in February of 1844. John Tyler and Julia Gardner are married on June 26, 1844. So it didn't take old Tyler long to take advantage of this situation and go in there and go after Julia. So they are married there in New York City. And, they're going to be married for the rest of his life. These two are going to be married for the rest of his life. They're going to have 7 children. And actually, and this is sort of an interesting thing, he actually has a great grandson still alive today. And you say, how in the world does this man who was president 1841 to 1845 still have a great grandson alive today? It has to do with the age of his great grandmother, Julia, in that she was very young and had a long list of children. And so it's hard to believe, but it is still true. I mean, his grandson, a grandson of Julia and John Tyler, was still alive in 2020, but he was 91 at the time. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not, but
Well,
good.
7 children. I mean, I think they had 7 children together, 30 years difference between the two. So yeah, I mean, you can see how this plays. And you speak of that relationship, and then also, this disaster in a way did bring about some good, because it allowed for the government, especially the Navy, to re-examine how they make cannons. They came up with new techniques, more structurally sound, and all of these things were happening. And that designated survivor that we talked about at the beginning, because had Tyler been on top of the deck when it exploded, and if he would have been killed, it would have fallen just because of where we were. I think it would have been the president pro tempore of the Senate would have been elevated to the presidency, which would have been unheard of. And even to this day,
2022 still.
And so just I'll put this last thing just in context with today. If any individual goes to the United States Naval Academy, they can see the Oregon, which was that the first gun. It is like right inside the main gate of the United States Naval Academy. So the Peacemaker's not there, but the gun that led to the Peacemaker being fired, it's still history. It's living history. It's something that you can still see. And, you think about the longest gun in the world at the time, the most powerful gun. I mean, Ray, I don't know how the ship stayed afloat. I don't know how it just dealt with just those on top of the deck. But fortunately for our nation, we did not have a constitutional crisis. We did not have a presidential crisis. And it allowed for there to be major changes to ensure that there are no crisis of that nature.
I don't know if you've ever been around a very large cannon when it's been fired. Have you?
No, I try to avoid that, except when I was at the circus.
Yeah, well, that's a different kind of cannon. I love reenactments, and there are several reenactments that I will go to on a regular basis. One of them is a Civil War reenactment, and there's a very large cannon on top of a fort, and the cannon was originally there as part of the original fort. It's a Civil War fort, and when you go, they will fire this cannon very similar to the Peacemaker here. They will fire this thing, twice maybe, because it's very old and it's very big. But I want to tell you, that thing will rock the ground. I mean, you feel it, and I'm good ways away from it when it's fired, but you can still feel just the impact of that cannon firing. So yeah, I cannot imagine this Peacemaker, the impact, that just how loud it had to be there just when it was firing regularly the first two times. But then that third time when it exploded, I mean, just the metal flying, the sound, the fire. What a horrific thing this must have been. And also, one more thing. Why did they want to fire this cannon the third time? Was it just, well, we're going to fire it one more time? That was part of it. But it was also they were approaching Mount Vernon, and they wanted to honor George Washington. You knew I was going to bring this up.
I say it always comes back to Father George, and in every podcast that we talked about, but they wanted to give a salute to him. And, I mean,
I was nowhere around, Chris. I was nowhere around. I was not born in 1844, so I was not there. But if I had been, I probably would have been all for firing that cannon the third time.
Well, I mean, that, it is one of that thing. I think it just speaks to maybe not so much today as back in the 1800s and 1700s, of just the monumental impact that George Washington had. This is 1843. There's a lot of time that has passed, since Washington was around.
Yeah, he died in December of 1799. So this is what, 45 years later? Exactly.
But yet, the father of the country, the one who saved the country, the one who, I think, the further we get in history, maybe, and this revisionist history and all kind of goes around. But the reality is, people back then knew that Washington had done something great, to the point that John Tyler and others wanted to salute this man who was resting comfortably in his grave. It wasn't like he's going to come out on the veranda and he's going to see everybody, he's going to wave hands. But the country still thought they owed its allegiance and dedication to the one who had helped preserve it. So, Ray, I just think that it's just interesting, this story, and I really appreciate you bringing it in, because it was something new. And it just goes to show you, every day we should learn something new in history, because they really are fascinating stories.
Absolutely. And one last thing, and then we'll wrap this particular episode up. Captain Stockton, the captain of the USS Princeton, of course, he's criticized for this. But Tyler actually moves to defending. And you want to know what Tyler's defense of the captain is? Life happens. I mean, that's not verbatim of what he said, but I mean, that's the effect of it. It's things happen and you can't always control it. And while that's true, I think it's also true, we talked about this earlier, that the co-inventor of this cannon, John Erickson, had warned them that this cannon may not be ready for prime time, and you're going out there and firing this thing may not necessarily be the best idea you've ever had. But there's one more note here, and it's sort of a sad note. There was one man, a naval officer, by the name of William Crane. He was a Commodore, and he really was haunted by what happened that day on the Princeton. It deeply bothered him to the point where he just constantly talked about it. He felt responsible for it. And in 1846, unfortunately, Mr. Crane slit his own throat because of the guilt he felt over what happened there that day at the USS Princeton. So this was a tragedy all the way around. 6 people dying, I believe it was, right there on the deck of the ship. Another man, sometimes considered the last casualty of this event, dying 2 years later at his own hands. But some good things did come out of it. You know, you have John Tyler finding his new bride, and John Calhoun, I guess, from his perspective, you know, even though his son was on the ship and I guess in danger, though he was not injured, you know, and he got an opportunity to sort of step up a little bit in government. So I guess from his perspective, a little bit, it may have been a little bit of a positive thing. But what a tragic event this was. And
Yeah.
Chris, you know, can you imagine? And we said this was the worst peacetime tragedy up until this point. Can you imagine having to be a pastor and having to preach this funeral and counsel these people and their families anyway through this event?
Yeah, I mean, because there's no words.
No.
Because you have, and this is, we've got to stop the podcast, but this is the theme of America, where we try to assert our powerfulness, our strength, and sometimes we do it in careless ways, and it has lasting consequences. And you can look at war to see that as well. You can look at, you know, you it's kind of that thing. I'm determined. I will go out of the way 45 minutes just to prove that I'm not lost, just to prove that I didn't do something wrong. I mean, people are constantly trying to dig themselves out of a hole instead of just saying, you know what, we made a mistake.
Yeah. And, you know, in political history and political science, you know, sometimes there's an old saying, it's always the cover up that gets you in trouble. It's
true.
Not so much the event, it's the cover up. Well, Chris,
but
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but, you know, as you mentioned, something good. I mean, Tyler's relationship got off to a bang. So, I mean, that was good.
And on that note, Chris, thank you for another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Listeners, you can catch us on iHeart, Spotify, Sounder FM, Google Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also share this podcast with your family and friends. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, or you can contact us at email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk with you later.